The coast of Maine, late 19th century. While those around him hurried to finish their log cabins in time to face the coastal winter, an Irish immigrant began something they had never seen and had no desire to understand. He built a second wall all around the cabin, leaving a wide gap, then stuffed it with wet, salt-smelling seaweed freshly gathered from the tidal flats. The neighbors called it madness. They called him a man inviting mold and rot. They said a single-walled cabin, carefully chinked and with plenty of firewood for the stove, was all a man needed to survive the winter. Still, he kept working, leaving moisture vents, lining with wind-blocking cloth, and adjusting every small detail in silence, ignoring the head shakes and mocking glances. Then that winter came earlier than usual. Nor'easters roared offshore, winds carrying salt and ice slamming the shore with force that pierced every plank seam and joint. In ordinary cabins, water froze solid in buckets just steps from the stove, and families burned bundle after bundle of wood yet woke up in bone-cutting cold. But what about that ridiculed cabin with its seaweed-stuffed double walls? What did it understand about wind, moisture, and still air that everyone else dismissed as foolish excess? If you value stories of practical wisdom forged in harsh conditions, subscribe. We have many more recorded tales worth remembering. That Irishman had arrived on this coast with 2 trunks, hands familiar with the smell of salt, and ideas about staying warm that the whole community would take an entire winter to reconsider. Eamon Callahan grew up along the Atlantic coast in an Irish fishing village, where the land was rocky and bare and the winter wind never paused long enough for anyone to forget it was there. There, wind was not just weather but a constant force, slipping through stone crevices, pouring down narrow valleys, whipping against house walls like a living thing with intent. From an early age, Eamon learned that a single barrier was rarely enough to stop what the weather wanted to take. His father had tended rough stone fish stores by the shore, plain but enduring buildings where cod and herring were stacked after the catch. Those stone walls were not only thick but had cavities packed with seaweed between 2 layers of planking. Seaweed hauled fresh from the water, salty and damp, yet when packed properly it did not rot or decay, and most importantly kept the air inside the store undisturbed. In summers, Eamon worked in larger fish houses where people did not try to make everything bone dry, but focused on keeping the temperature steady, stopping the wind before it could carry away cold or heat. He had also slept on storm-bound boats, lying on cold wooden decks with bundles of wet seaweed stuffed beneath the planking, and he remembered clearly the difference between the biting cold of wind blowing straight through the body and the deep, still cold that could be endured through the night. No one taught him these things with words, but the sea taught patiently. From the sea, Eamon learned that seaweed does not stiffen like wood or stone in the cold, that its structure holds countless tiny air pockets, and those pockets are what truly retain heat. He understood that moisture itself is not the same as cold, that water only becomes the enemy when wind forces it to move, and above all, he understood that wind is the true thief of heat, stealing warmth faster than any material can hold it. When he left his homeland for America in the late 19th century, Eamon brought little baggage but carried that understanding whole. He came to the coast of Maine, a place where pine stands thinned and rock began to show through the soil, where the Atlantic was not blocked by sheltered bays or long headlands, and the wind struck the shore in the same voice he had known since childhood. When he staked his claim on land right by the sea, Eamon recognized at once that the sound of the wind here was identical to home, heavy, damp, salt-laden, and never truly silent. Winter in Maine arrived fast and merciless, allowing little time to adjust. From his first autumn, he saw the log cabins around him struggle against the sea wind, seams carefully chinked yet whistling at night, and stove fires needing constant feeding just to keep bucket water from freezing. Eamon began building his cabin the way the community expected. He raised a pine frame of modest size, walls carefully chinked, low-pitched roof to reduce wind catch. In that phase, no one paid him special notice. He worked slowly, precisely, like any other settler racing to finish shelter before winter struck. Neighbors nodded as they passed, assuming he would soon move on to more familiar tasks like stockpiling wood, mending nets, or fencing. But once the first wall was done, Eamon did not stop. Instead of finishing the interior, he started nailing up a second layer of planking parallel to the first, leaving an unusually wide gap between the 2 walls. The gap was large enough for an adult to reach an arm into, and that alone made passers-by slow their steps. Then they saw Eamon hauling back from the tidal flats heavy, dark, dripping masses of seaweed that carried the sharp salt smell of the sea. He did not choose dried or pre-sun cured weed, but fresh strands washed in by each tide. He shook them to drop the sand, let the water drain, then packed them straight into the space between the walls. Word spread quickly in that small coastal settlement. Fishermen chuckled quietly when they saw him pulling cartloads of seaweed to his cabin. Loggers shook their heads, and the general store owner retold the story to customers as an oddity worth discussing in idle moments. People said he was stuffing rot into his walls, that by the time snow covered the ground the smell would be unbearable. They warned that wet seaweed would grow mold, that salt water would eat the wood from inside, that when hard freeze came everything would turn to ice and destroy the structure. No one confronted Eamon directly. There were no loud arguments or open conflict. Instead there were lingering looks, muffled laughs when his back was turned, and whispers repeated often enough to become quiet consensus. Eamon did not react. He did not pause to explain that back home people had packed seaweed into walls for generations. He said nothing about the fish stores, the storm-bound boats, or how wind moves. He simply kept working, and most of what he did went unnoticed as unimportant. He fluffed the seaweed loose rather than packing it tight, so the strands did not press together and retained invisible tiny air spaces. He carefully avoided overfilling, allowing the material to shift slightly with temperature changes without stressing the wood. At the base of the walls he left small moisture vents, enough for water to escape when needed, and covered them with coarse mesh, so the seaweed stayed put. On the inner side he lined thick canvas to cut direct drafts before they reached the seaweed layer that so many considered unnecessary. Everything he did happened quietly, without a real audience that cared. No one asked why he paid attention to such small details, and he did not offer explanations. To Eamon, this was not an experiment needing proof or a challenge to others' building ways. It was simply the way he knew to build a wall that did not try to fight winter with brute strength or thickness alone, but that robbed the wind of its ability to steal heat the moment it touched the house. The first storm arrived earlier than the Maine coast residents expected, a nor'easter that formed offshore and drove straight inland with speed and weight no one was mentally ready for. It began with a shift in wind direction carrying a heavier than usual salt smell, the kind that made longtime sea dwellers instantly uneasy because they knew it signaled a large air mass pressing close to land. By afternoon, clouds lowered, light turned dull gray as if color had been wrung out, and the wind began whistling around house corners, not the familiar howl of dry cold but a heavy wet sound carrying sea moisture. Rain started first, cold drops striking the planking, then quickly turning to wet snow that clung to every surface. As the temperature dropped a few more degrees, that wet snow froze into a slick glaze coating roofs, fences, door handles, and mooring lines. The wind kept rising, flinging fine salt that stung skin and made eyes water, and that very salt made the cold penetrate deeper, as if it found its own paths through every wood grain. In the single-walled cabins along the shore, winter immediately bared its teeth. Water in buckets near the stove formed a thin skin of ice within hours, thickening as night fell. Seams chinked carefully and autumn began to whistle, wind threading through them in sharp cold streams that lashed ankles and the back of the neck. The stove fire was no longer a steady source of warmth, but something requiring constant tending. A few hours' neglect left only ashes, and warmth vanished so fast that breath became visible indoors. In one house near the wharf, an older man sat closer to the stove than usual. Trembling hands stretched toward the flames, yet still too cold to hold a cup of hot water steadily. Wind through the joints made the fire flicker wildly, surging then gasping as if the house itself were breathing hard. Not far away, a family with 2 small children gathered every blanket in one spot on the floor near the stove because the back bedroom had become unusable. The walls were so cold that touching them burned the hand, and moisture from the children's breath condensed into frosty streaks that froze on the wood. The children cried not from pain but from cold, a persistent cold that clung to the body and refused to leave. Offshore, a few fishing boats returned later than planned, hulls coated in ice, ropes stiff as iron bars. The men stepped onto the wharf in soaked clothes, salt crusted white on their boots, and when they entered their cabins the cold did not release them as they hoped. Instead of refuge, they faced rooms where the wind seemed to have arrived first, circling the corners, sucking warmth out faster than they could build a fire. Night fell and the storm did not ease but gathered force. Snow mixed with rain blew sideways, piling in thick drifts against house walls, then freezing, adding weight to already fragile structures. The sound of wind became a constant background, unbroken, turning sleep into fragmented dozing. The elderly woke repeatedly from cold, curling tighter in coats worn even in bed. Young children coughed from the cold, damp air, their breath forming small clouds in the dark. In many homes, wood was fed to the stove far more often than in previous years, and stockpiles calculated to last the whole winter began shrinking alarmingly in just the first few days. The next morning, under low gray light filtering through heavy clouds, the storm still raged. Wind kept blowing with the same unrelenting voice, and the cold did not let up even slightly. Those who stepped outside to check damage found ice thick on everything from roofs to barn doors, and they understood this was not a brief cold snap that would soon pass. No one said it aloud, but the shared feeling throughout the community was that this winter was harsher than normal. It was no longer about how a house was built or whether a wall was thick or thin. The early season nor'easter had shifted every thought to something rawer and more immediate. How to survive the days ahead when the sea wind carried salt, moisture, and cold with no intention of stopping. On the morning of the third day after the first storm of the season had passed through, when the wind still held its heavy tone and the ice had not yet melted from the roofs, one of Eamon's neighbors stopped by, not because he needed help or to offer greetings, but simply out of curiosity. The man had passed the cabin many times in the previous days, each time slowing his steps a little more, and finally curiosity won out. He knocked on the door, waited in the cold wind, and when Eamon opened it, the first thing that surprised him was not the warmth, but the absence of any smell that people had expected. There was no smell of seaweed, no musty odor, no heavy air typical in houses trying desperately to hold in warmth. Inside the cabin, the air was still dense and drier than expected. The wooden walls had no condensation, no thin layer of frost like in other homes, but were dry to the touch. The fire in the stove burned low, not fiercely, but steadily, and Eamon said he had started it the evening before and let it sustain itself through the night. On the floor, a bucket of water placed near the stove, which in other cabins would freeze solid in just a few hours, remained unchanged, its surface calm with no signs of crystallization. The neighbor stood there longer than necessary, his eyes scanning small details he had never noticed before. The door did not creak from the wind's pressure. No cold draft swept across ankles, breath did not form white clouds in front of faces, but he offered no praise. He did not ask Eamon how he had done it, or why the things everyone had warned about were not happening. Instead, there was a prolonged silence, a silence carrying more suspicion than acknowledgement. Finally, he only muttered a remark, more to himself than to the host, that perhaps it was just luck, that maybe this storm was not cold enough, that winter was long and sooner or later everything would reveal itself. Then he pulled on his hat, stepped outside, letting the sea wind whip his face as if to remind himself that what he had just seen could not be the norm. News of that visit did not spread in the way the earlier mockery had. No full stories were retold in the store or the pub, only scattered comments, shrugs accompanied by probably just lucky. A few others passed Eamon's cabin more slowly, looked longer, but no one was confident enough to knock. The old beliefs had not collapsed, but a small crack had appeared, thin and hard to notice, like the first layer of ice forming on water before the whole bucket freezes solid. The community continued stoking fires, continued sealing cracks, continued believing that with enough wood and enough patience, winter would pass. But somewhere in the thoughts of a few, the image of a cabin that did not freeze during the first nor'easter had begun to exist as an unnamed possibility, not strong enough to change behavior, but enough to make the earlier laughter lose some of its certainty. After the first storm withdrew, it did not take the cold with it as many had hoped, but only left a false lull before winter truly began to reveal its nature. The wind still blew steadily from sea to land, no longer howling fiercely as in the nor'easter days, but continuously enough to keep temperatures from rising even slightly. Mornings arrived with frost-coating windowsills and doorknobs, and evenings closed in the weak yellow light of fires that had to be maintained without pause. In the single-walled cabins, the cold no longer struck like a blow but seeped in gradually, bit by bit, as if it had time to find every remaining weakness. Water in buckets no longer froze instantly, but each morning a thin layer of ice appeared that needed breaking before use. Wind slipped through small cracks previously unnoticed, creating silent cold currents along floors and walls. People grew accustomed to wearing coats even while eating dinner, to waking in the night to add wood to the stove, to sleep broken into short segments by the cold waking them. Wood piles continued to dwindle faster than planned, and the stacks prepared in the fall began to look thinner lower though winter was only in its early stage. Children adapted in their own way, curling near the stove, learning not to stray from the heat source, while the elderly endured worse, joints aching from prolonged cold and breathing growing heavier each morning. Meanwhile, Eamon's life did not present a stark contrast, but rather a steady straight line running parallel to the struggles of others. He still rose early, rekindled the stove with a few logs, no more than necessary, and let the fire burn slow and even, not flaring up and dying out like in many other homes. At night, he slept through without being woken by whistling wind or the chill forcing him to turn for more blankets. Mornings came without breaking ice in the water bucket, without drying clothes from condensation on walls. Days passed in a normal rhythm, without the constant feeling of resisting or patching, and it was that very normality that began to draw attention. A few passers-by noticed that Eamon's chimney did not emit thick smoke all day like theirs, that he did not constantly add wood, and that the light in his cabin went out earlier at night, a sign of uninterrupted sleep. But those observations were kept private, not yet enough to become stories or admissions. In the community, old beliefs continued to dictate behavior: add wood, seal gaps again, endure a little longer. People told themselves that every winter was hard at first, that the body would adjust, that after the initial weeks things would ease. Yet the cold showed no sign of relenting, and fatigue began to accumulate in subtle ways. There was no major event, no dramatic moment, just a string of cold days long enough to wear down endurance. In that context, Eamon's quiet stability existed as an unnamed anomaly, a possibility the community was not ready to accept, but could no longer entirely ignore. Winter had shifted from a short-term challenge to a persistent reality, and the story was no longer about how someone built their house, but about who could maintain daily life without being drained day by the cold. The second storm did not arrive as unexpectedly as the first, but it carried a heaviness that made even those who had endured many winters feel uneasy well before the initial gusts reached shore. Out at sea, the water turned lead gray, its surface taut as if pulled tight, and fishermen returned earlier than usual, carrying a sense that this time it was not just another cold spell. When the storm hit, it did not rage fiercely for a short time and then withdraw, but pressed down on the Maine coast with constant force, stretching from day to day. The wind blew strong and steady, carrying drier, sharper cold, and temperatures dropped to levels no longer judged by feeling but by consequences. Snow did not fall thickly as in the first nor'easter, but in small hard grains driven by wind against the ground and house walls, forming thin but stubborn ice layers that clung tightly and melted slowly. At night, thermometers plunged to numbers many families had only seen in the worst winters, and days offered no warmth to compensate. In the single-walled cabins, the cold was no longer mere discomfort but a direct threat. Children began coughing more, breathing wheezy in the cold, dry air, small hands turning purple despite layers of cloth. The elderly fared worse, their bodies no longer generating enough heat to counter constant loss, and each morning's awakening required greater effort than the day before. In many homes, bucket water not only froze overnight but solidified completely, forcing people to melt snow or ice for use. Wind threaded through cracks with frightening persistence, sucking warmth out so fast that stove fires had to be fed constantly, allowing no lapse. Firewood became a serious issue. Stacks calculated for the whole winter had dwindled considerably in just weeks, and as the second storm dragged on, many families faced decisions they had never imagined. In one house near the woods, old shelves were dismantled, tables and chairs broken for fuel, the sound of splintering wood echoing at night as a quiet admission that this winter exceeded ordinary preparation. Elsewhere, families consolidated bedrooms, crowding everyone into one space near the stove to reduce the area needing heat. Outer rooms were abandoned, doors sealed, becoming unofficial cold storage. Blankets were piled in thick layers, clothes worn even in sleep, and the breath of many in a small space formed a thin frost on ceilings that froze into ice. The air in those rooms grew heavy, both cold and stuffy, but still preferable to facing drafts directly. Children slept fitfully, often waking from cold, and coughs ringing through the night kept adults from deep sleep. The elderly were placed closest to the stove, but even there, warmth was not enough to chase away prolonged numbness. The storm continued without respite, day after day, as if testing how long the community could endure before something broke. Small roads iced over, travel grew difficult, and isolation heightened the strain. No one spoke of this winter as just a bit harsher than usual. Conversations shifted to how much wood someone had left, what they had burned to stay warm, and who in the household was visibly weakening. The cold was no longer weather but a clear danger, a slow but resolute killer, day by day squeezing the life from houses built for milder winters. In that setting, the community began to realize they were not just weathering a storm, but confronting the limits of what they had believed sufficient, and every small decision in these days could mark the line between holding on or surrendering to a winter with no intention of easing. On the third night of the second storm, when the wind no longer howled but blew steadily like constant pressure against every wall, the first knocks sounded at Eamon's cabin door, not frantic, panicked rapping, but heavy, slow knocks, as if the person outside was weighing each one, both from cold and hesitation. When Eamon opened the door, wind rushed in instinctively, carrying cold and salt, but behind it stood a man with hunched shoulders, coat coated in thin ice, eyes red from lack of sleep. He said little, only asking if his wife and small child could shelter for the night. No apology for earlier words, no mention of the laughter that had rung out when the Seaweed was hauled in. Eamon simply nodded and opened the door wider. Soon after, more footsteps emerged from the dark. Another family arrived, then an elderly person with their son, then two children wrapped in thick blankets, faces pale from cold. The knocks continued, not rushed but steady, as if the community had reached a silent consensus that this was the only place with another option. No one spoke of why they came, and Eamon did not ask. Inside the cabin, space quickly grew crowded. Chairs were pushed against walls, extra blankets spread on the floor, and people sat closer than they were used to. But despite more bodies, the air retained its characteristic stillness, with no cold drafts sweeping across legs or necks. The stove fire was fed a few more logs, burning slow and even, without needing to blaze fiercely to compensate for lost heat. The newcomers gradually sensed the difference, not through reason but through their bodies. Hands no longer numb after minutes, breathing slowing and the persistent cold in bones beginning to recede a bit. Children stopped shivering, leaning against adults and falling asleep still in coats. The elderly were arranged near the stove, and for the first time in many nights, their breathing was not wheezy from cold air. No one praised the house, no one voiced surprise. Any acknowledgement, if present, existed only in how they removed gloves and did not rush to put them back on, in setting water buckets on the floor without worry they would freeze by morning. The cabin was cramped, but warm in a steady, unhurried way, and that very steadiness made people speak less. The earlier mocking laughter was entirely absent, not because it was retracted, but because in this situation it had no place. The night passed with sounds utterly different from other cabins, not wind whistling through cracks, not wood crackling from being overloaded too quickly, but the even breathing of many sleeping in one space. As wind continued pressing against outer walls, inside Eamon's cabin, that small community for the first time in days did not have to stay awake just to fight the cold. And though no one said it, all understood that being here was no longer curiosity or luck, but a necessary choice to survive the long night enveloping the coast. The morning after, with the sky still gray and the wind showing no sign of easing, Eamon began doing what needed to be done without naming it or offering long explanations. He simply pointed outside to the spare planks, leaning against his cabin wall, and said that if they wanted to get through the coming days they needed to give the wind nothing to grip onto first. There was no lecture, no claim that this would save them, just specific actions repeated. A few men went out into the cold wind, setting up temporary plank shields a short distance from their house walls, enough for the wind to hit them before reaching the main siding. Eamon showed them how to secure the planks without pressing them tight against the wall, leaving a quiet airspace between the two surfaces. He told them to haul wet, heavy seaweed from the tidal flats and stuff it into that gap without packing it down, letting the strands stay loose. When someone worried about the smell and dampness, Eamon just shrugged and kept working, as if the answer was already there in the results they were experiencing. Inside, he guided them to hang burlap, old blankets or any thick fabric on the inner side of the walls, especially on the windward sides, to cut the cold drafts before they spread through the room. No terms, no abstract concepts. He did not call it a method or a solution, just said this was how he kept warm when he could not spare extra wood. The others followed, not because they fully believed, but because they had few options left. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, that small community moved between cabins, erecting planks, stuffing seaweed, hanging fabric, working in silence, broken only by the wind and the crunch of ice underfoot. No one took notes, no one measured, and no one discussed why it might work. The only thing noticed was the different feeling upon returning inside, drafts much weaker, stove flames no longer pulled sideways, and warmth lingering longer. Children were brought back to the temporarily shielded cabins, where they no longer shivered the moment they stepped in. The elderly were rearranged closer to stoves in smaller, less drafty spaces, and their breathing grew less labored. No one felt they were learning a new technique. They were simply copying what had proven to be working. Eamon did not monitor results or go house to house. Checking, he returned to his own cabin at dusk, leaving others to adjust according to their own circumstances. That way of staying warm spread not through words but through one person seeing another do it and noticing the difference when crossing a threshold. In the silence of a community worn out by cold, windbreak planks, wet seaweed, and old blankets, gradually became familiar tools, not because they were named or celebrated, but because they helped people get through each day without burning things they could no longer afford to lose. In the days that followed, while the storm had not fully withdrawn but the wind had become a familiar presence rather than a shock, the cabins along the coast began to change in quiet but noticeable ways to those living inside them. The temporary windbreak planks from the first day were no longer taken down but fastened more securely, braced with extra stakes on the hardest-hit sides. Seaweed continued to be hauled from the tidal flats, no more than needed, added to remaining gaps, this time with more care not to pack it tight. Inside homes, old blankets, burlap, and thick fabrics were hung on windward walls, creating a soft barrier that softened cold drafts before they spread through rooms. Living spaces in many families shrank, but in that shrinking warmth began to stay longer. People realized stove fires no longer needed constant feeding through the night, that kindling them before bed meant waking without cold slicing into lungs. Bucket water, though still cold, no longer froze solid in better shielded cabins. These changes did not happen all at once or perfectly, but even small improvements were enough for bodies to feel. Residents began observing naturally, not to find theory, but to remember what helped them sleep a little better. They touched walls in the morning, noting if cold had lessened. They listened to stove fires, seeing if they burned steady or were pulled off course by wind. Short conversations happened outside, not argumentative, just practical remarks exchanged while erecting planks or hauling seaweed. This spot has less wind, that one holds warmth longer. No one called it a method, and no one mentioned much the person who had started it all. What remained was the different feeling when stepping through a door. Children sleeping deeper and waking less from cold, the elderly no longer needing to sit by the stove all day. Cabins that had once been nearly identical began showing individual signs of adaptation, an extra shield on the north side, keeping an air gap instead of sealing tight, hanging more fabric where wind most often slipped in. The change was not loud and did not look like major reform, but like the way a community learns something through its own experience. While the sea wind kept blowing out there, people were no longer just enduring cold passively, but quietly remembering what helped them through each night and day, and adjusting their homes to last longer in a winter showing no sign of yielding. Finally, after many weeks bearing down on the coast, winter began to retreat, not with a sudden shift but with small signs hard to notice without paying attention. Wind from the sea softened, no longer carrying the same sharp cold, and mornings brought paler light reflecting off thinning ice. Snow did not melt right away, but no longer accumulated, leaving dirty gray patches along roads and around house foundations. When rare calm days appeared, people ventured outside more, not to celebrate, but to take stock of what winter had taken and what remained. Damage showed clearly on many single-walled cabins, siding warped by ice and damp, seams split from constant wind pressure, windows hard to close tight again because wood frames had distorted. Many families realized firewood reserves had dwindled to worrying levels, and furnishings burned on the coldest nights would not be easily replaced. Come spring, some elderly had weakened visibly, their bodies paying the price for weeks in prolonged cold, while children were thinner, coughing less but not fully recovered. In that context, Eamon's cabin stood out not for flashy difference, but for its quiet intactness. Outer planks remained straight, no warping or splitting, and stepping inside brought no smell of damp or signs of mold. Inner walls stayed dry, without the thin frost layer that had become familiar in many other homes. The stove fire burned as before, needing no major adjustments, and remaining firewood was enough to show it had never been consumed in desperation. No one organized gatherings to compare, and no declarations were made. The difference simply existed in details anyone could see who bothered to look. As ice melted gradually and paths grew passable, people began repairing what was broken, rebuilding fences, replacing cracked siding, and preparing for the new fishing season. But while working, many paused longer near Eamon's cabin, observing how the outer shield protected the inner structure, how the air gap between walls had let the house survive winter with little loss. There was no direct praise, no public acknowledgement, but the silence this time carried a different tone from before. It was no longer suspicion or mockery, but consideration, a process of recounting not just material damage, but old assumptions that no longer held after a harsh winter. As spring arrived more clearly and post-winter repairs became the common priority, changes began appearing discreetly but consistently. Some families, instead of just replacing cracked siding or sealing old gaps, started erecting secondary walls on the hardest-hit wind sides, setting them far enough from the main wall not to touch. There was no meeting to agree on the approach, no announcement that this was the new direction. Seaweed, once seen only as drift trash, began being gathered with clearer purpose. People hauled it from tidal flats, shook off sand and let it drain naturally, then stacked it near cabins under repair. There were no longer laughs when someone wheeled seaweed past, no more jokes about smell or rot. This shift happened without revisiting the past. No one said the earlier mockery had been wrong, and no one stepped forward claiming to have been right. In short talks by the dock, or in yards, people spoke only of specifics, how wide the gap should be, how loose the seaweed needed to stay, where windbreaks worked best. Those conversations were practical, without debate or boasting. Eamon did not become the center of attention. He continued daily work, fixing small spots on his cabin, preparing for the new fishing season, and answering only when asked, with short replies and no long explanations. Seaweed appearing in new walls was no longer noteworthy, but a choice considered seriously like wood or fabric. Things once laughed at were simply no longer funny, not because they were celebrated, but because they had proven their worth in harsh conditions. No one needed to conclude who was right or wrong after such a long winter. What mattered more was that the community had kept what worked and discarded what could no longer withstand sea wind. In that silence, old assumptions were gradually replaced by new experience, not recorded in words or argument, but in walls being built differently, preparing for winters that would return. Many years passed since that first winter, and the building method once seen as odd had spread farther than anyone in the community then could have imagined. New cabins rising along the coast and farther inland often featured a secondary wall, sometimes only on the windward side, sometimes surrounding the whole house with a gap large enough to hold still air that wind could not penetrate. Seaweed was used in some places, sawdust or dry grass in others, depending on what was easiest to get, but the principle was the same and passed by word of mouth as common sense rather than invention. No one called it Eamon's Way, and his name rarely appeared in stories told to newcomers. When someone asked why it was done that way, the answer was usually just because it works, or because the wind here is fierce. Later winters remained harsh, sea winds still carrying salt and cold, but consequences were no longer as heavy. Fewer families burned furnishings to stay warm, fewer children fell ill from prolonged cold, and the elderly had more springs to look forward to. This change was not marked by monuments or official records, but by smaller numbers in the midwife's log, by fewer houses abandoned after storms, and by mornings when bucket water no longer froze solid. Eamon aged along with that community, living in his cabin, repairing when needed and replacing insulation when it lost its original looseness. He did not become someone sought for advice, nor did he try to protect a legacy in his name. What he had done blended into how people built and lived, to the point it was no longer separated for individual recognition. When later generations grew up, they simply knew that in this windy place you did not build single walls if you wanted to get through winter decently. That way endured not as a story about one particular person, but as part of shared understanding, quiet but lasting, helping make later winters less cruel to those who lived by sea and wind. If you value stories about practical knowledge born from labor, challenge, and time, please subscribe so you do not miss the next ones. Thank you for reading. See you on the next journey.